Okay, make sure that you title your notes Paint Media Oil-Based versus Water-Based. You can pause the video at any time to write down the terms and concepts. Okay, so oil paint is pigment suspended in an oil binder. The oil binders are usually linseed, walnut, or safflower. They are different plants or trees that the oils are taken from. This right here is a image of molecules of the binders right here um, with the pigment suspended in them. So from here, acrylic paints are a pigment suspended in a plastic binder, which is an acrylic polymer. So it is a type of oil still. It's just an oil byproduct, which is, the plastic, the acrylic. But the acrylic paint is water-based, where oil paint is oil-based. And this is a close-up of what the pigment suspended in the binders look like with the water molecules in between. So this is the acrylic polymer, and these are pigments, and these are water molecules. All right, and then lastly, there's watercolor paint, which is pigment suspended in gum arabic, which is another natural binder produced from the sap of an acacia Senegal tree. And remember, oil and water do not mix. So what happens when you mix oil and water is they separate. Oils usually float to the surface while water is more dense and sinks to the bottom. This works in a glass cup as well as on a canvas. If you paint with both, make sure that acrylic is underneath the oil. And I'll show you examples of what happens if you do otherwise. Okay, so I had started this painting. I painted a red acrylic base down and then started painting acrylic over the top of it. Shortly thereafter, I noticed that there were parts of the painting that were starting to peel rather quickly. And then I noticed that the tube of paint said oil on it. So one of my kiddos stuck a tube of oil paint into my acrylic set, and then 6 hours of work later, so this all took about 6 hours of work, the acrylic started to peel off and I had to start over. But I really liked how it turned out anyways. But I mean, just to save you some time and some heartache, make sure that you are painting with the right paints. And if you do paint with an acrylic and oil, make sure the acrylic is the base, and you can paint over the top of that with oil, but you can't do it the other way around. All right, make sure you draw this grid down and separate it into media, pros, and cons, and then label it oil paint, acrylic paint, and watercolor paint. So for oil paint, the pros of oil paint and the cons of oil paint. Oil paint is the oldest paint medium. It's been used for thousands of years. There's more pigment in the oil base, which allows for richer and more vivid colors. So the oil can hold more pigment. However, the oil paint is more slow drying, depending on the humidity of the area, room temperature, and the pigment used. So some pigments dry slower than others, Cadmium reds and other types of reds are notorious for really slow drying, if drying at all. There are paintings that are maybe hundreds of years old that still have yet to dry, as far as the reds. Um, but the pro is that it is workable over time. That means you can still work with the wet paint over a long period of time for blending or adding colors or adding other effects. So the cons is that it contains some toxic heavy metals, lead, cobalt, and cadmium, which are the pigments that are used. Traditionally, it requires solvents to clean the brushes or to thin the paint, so like soaps or thinners or things like that, which can be harmful to the environment. Its slow drying time can be a con, especially if you need something done quickly. Improper disposal of paint and solvents down drains will pollute water. So when and if you ever paint with oils, let the chemicals dissolve. So thinners and solvents, let them evaporate into the air. Um, it'll be less harmful that way than to pour it down a drain and to pollute the drinking water. Okay, and let's see. It typically requires gesso, which is a water-based primer that coats and protects surfaces. Because the oil is corrosive, especially on fibers. So that is why you have to take that extra step of painting down a layer of gesso. Okay, so let's click here. You don't need to write this down, but make sure you understand that there are solvents added to oil paints to temporarily change the way that they work. And it's designed to evaporate evenly and totally as the oil paint dries. It's used to dissolve resins and make mediums and clean up. So it cleans brushes and cleans up messes. Um, it's used as a solvent in a well, or use it as a solvent in a well ventilated area. The fumes can be harmful to you, so make sure you open windows or paint outside or somewhere where there's a lot of space and airflow. Turpentine is traditionally used as an oil solvent, and it's made from tree resin, and it evaporates quickly, but it does release harmful vapors that can absorb through your skin also. Mineral spirits are also another type of solvent. It is petroleum based, and it evaporates a little bit slower, and it also releases harmful vapors. So again, that's why we don't use oils in this class. Okay, so acrylics, they were developed in the 1940s. They're fast drying, they're water soluble when wet. That means, like, when they're wet, you can mix it with water to thin it out, or you can clean it up with water. Um, but it is only soluble when it is wet. When it dries, it turns into a hard plastic, and then you can no longer mix water or other colors with it. So it's water resistant when it's dry. When it's dry, it will not reactivate. That means it's just a solid plastic when it's dry. However, there's a new line of acrylics that is being put out there that is still workable after it dries. That means they've made it somehow where after it dries, you can still add water and other paints to mix. But it is versatile, even more versatile than oil paints and watercolors, um, because it can be painted on like an acrylic or like an oil and have a slow drying time if you add some different additives, or it can be thinned out like a watercolor. So it's really versatile. The drying time can be extended. It has a thick body for textural work, and it cleans with water. It's durable, which means it's less prone to cracking. It's flexible and hardens over time. The cons is that it is a relatively new medium, which is fast drying, um, meaning that you don't have a lot of time to do some work, as if you would an oil that stays wet for a long period of time. Um, it dries slightly darker than it looks out of the tube. It's easier to damage brushes. So when it dries on your brushes, then you either have ruined the brush or you're going to have to spend a lot of hours trying to clean off the dried acrylic. It's not as respected in the art community. So, for the same quality of painting, an art buyer will pay hundreds of $1,000s less for acrylic paints than they would oils, just because oils have been around for so long and are so traditional. Um, it contains petrochemicals and heavy metals that can pollute water. Sometimes it requires gesso to prep surfaces. So, it's still not as healthy a paint as oils. And it can be complicated if you need to use gesso to prime a surface. But, again, it is the most flexible, most versatile paint there is out there. Um, let's look at this. So, proper disposal of any paint is to allow the solvent, so water or mineral spirits or turpentine, to evaporate outdoors or in a well ventilated room. When it is thoroughly dried, peel away the dry paint and take it to a hazardous waste disposal site. It is less hazardous to scrape unused paint into a trash bin than to wash it down a sink. So when it goes to the landfill, the trash will get processed. Whereas if it goes into the water, the molecules of heavy metals and oils in the water are going to be hard to break down and to filter. So try to dispose of your paint properly. Okay, and lastly, watercolors. It's generally the least expensive. They come in tiny tubes and you really don't need a lot of it. A small tube of watercolor mixed with water can provide yards and yards of coverage. Offers a nice coloration, nice color saturation. It dries pretty quickly, and it's easier to paint large areas with the watercolor because you can thin it out and you can use a giant wash brush. Large and small unpainted areas are expected. So, places where you would leave the white paper or the white canvas, that's part of the technique of watercolor. Whereas oil paint and acrylic, traditionally you paint the entire surface and don't leave any area unexposed or exposed, I guess. Um, if you paint and leave areas of paper unpainted in watercolor, it doesn't look like it's unfinished, whereas it would look unfinished if you did that with acrylic or oil paint. Oops, sorry. Techniques are simple in theory but difficult to master. It requires a lot of practice, more difficult to cover mistakes, more fragile method in two ways: the paper surface and the fact that one drop of water can ruin details which took hours to create. So you've got to be really careful with watercolor. Because it takes so little pigment and so little paint to create the effects. Like if you drop ink or watercolor or water on your artwork, it can definitely ruin the work that you've done. It also contains heavy metals that can pollute water. So all of these different media use heavy metals as part of their pigments. And those heavy metals, when you rinse them down a sink, go into the drinking water, and it's really hard to get those metals out of water. And those metals, again, can be harmful to human beings and animals and plants. And lastly, don't waste paint. Use as little as you can and salvage what you don't. All right, happy painting.